Hello everyone, I'm High Treason and welcome to Duke Nukem 3D Mapping Taboo Episode 2. Going to be a bit of a longer one today. Last time we learned how to abuse conveyor belts and their ability to push sprites through walls. This time we're going to take that knowledge and use it to spawn objects on command, and I use the word spawn in quotation marks, as well as something completely different. We did also learn a little about respawners in the test episodes, and one aspect of them that was briefly mentioned is really important here. Respawners are not compatible with everything. There do exist lists of what they can spawn, and those are worth reading, as some of the things you can make them do are quite surprising and can be really useful. The problem comes when you want to spawn something unusual, something weird like rubber ducks, or cracked bricks and rubble. These won't work with the respawn sprite, and there aren't really any clean ways to simply have them appear without using custom code. Or is there? Well, of course there is, we just have to abuse the game some more. The simplest solution would be to stuff a tiny elevator sector where you want the thing to appear, and then put that thing in the elevator sector. In some cases this is your only option, and it might work, generally if the player isn't looking when the elevator comes up. The problem is that you do now have a tiny hole in the floor, and it takes the elevator some time to reach this height. If it's a collectible like a keycard, you will need the elevator to start low enough that the player can't collect it early, but then they might have problems collecting it when it comes to the top due to the small sectory boundaries. Also, raising the elevator too quickly causes visual problems sometimes. On top of this, the sprite will always have the properties of the elevator sector, and that might not be ideal in some cases, like what if we want to spawn that thing onto a belt? A belt, well, that might just be the solution. Last time we looked at conveyor belt loops by pushing things through white walls. I hinted that you could stack effects, and this is one of the things I had in mind. We're going to move the conveyor belt from one location in the map to another. Conveyors have this annoying attribute of not being easily toggled. They can't be enabled or disabled using activators, so you can't just start the map with the belt off and then turn it on later. Sliding doors, on the other hand, those can be triggered quite easily. First we need to make an ST25, a sliding door, then stuff an SE15 in there and give it a unique height tag, followed by placing an activator or a master switch, whichever picks your fancy depending on how you're going to do this. In this case it's going to be moving to the right, so we need to turn the SE15 to the left. We need an SE24 in a door for it to act as a conveyor belt, facing to the right. GP speed sprites determine how far the door will move. In this case it needs to move 1024 units, so the GP speed should be half of this, at 512. Be mindful of the speed of the belt, as we do know this can cause problems, and obviously the farther you want the door to go, the faster the belt's going to move. Generally slower belts are better, and I've not played with the half speed one that is in the game's effects and generally unused. Might be useful if you do need the door to move a long way. It should be that the door sector always outruns the object in it, so it doesn't end up going out of bounds in the transitional period. Next, just like last time, there needs to be a sector that overlaps with this conveyor. That has a conveyor going the other way, to the left, making a belt loop. Once this is done, you can place your desired sprite, in this case a rubber duck, in one of the belt sectors and set up anything you need for it, whether that's size or transparency or tags. Obviously the height of the belts should match the sector you want to move the sprite to. There is a difference with this loop though. We need to make the belt that acts as a door into a larger sector. Generally twice as long as it might be otherwise, if not longer. It should overhang enough that once it's slid over to the new location, the return loop still overlaps into it, as the sprite might be in that sector when the door moves, and if the door doesn't overhang anymore, obviously it's going to be sent out of bounds, and we don't want sprites drifting off into the ether and crashing the game in a few years' time. The player isn't likely to ever see the crash, but they might be annoyed as to why an item they need is now missing and they can't finish the level. That's generally not a good thing. All you need now is something to trigger that door. I'll use an access switch here, but it could be anything. Touch plates, target logic machines, whatever you want that can activate doors. Once the door is activated, it will move to the position we determined with the GP speed and push the sprite through its wall, now causing it to appear in the sector we want it to spawn in. Yeah, we've now summoned a rubber duck into being from the perspective of a normal player, and probably caused a few lesser knowledgeable mappers to scratch their heads and open the editor to figure out how the hell you just made that happen, as I assume they'd know it doesn't work with the respawner. You could always set up a second identical belt somewhere with a target on it that would be pushed into yet another intangible sector in order to trigger a dud respawn, just to make the star animation happen, but we'll cover targets another time. I do have an example of this in the example map though, so I guess you could have a quick look at it, and I think there probably are other ways we could do it. However, this is just the way I would go about it. But for now, we're still covering fairly basic things. Anyway, using what we just made, we can obviously have a player leave an area, trigger a bunch of belts, and then have them come back to all sorts of things. That corridor seems to have taken damage in our absence. Of course, we know what's really going on, kicking that duck made some more belts move. Of course, we can move things into other active sectors, like more conveyors, so you can have a moving helicopter appear or something like that. I would imagine this is a very niche use case, but I did have to do this in Dimension Shift. So what about the elevator method? This is useful for some extreme cases. I find myself using it for keycards because they aren't compatible with spawners or belts. That is to say, you can spawn them, but you can only spawn blue ones in any currently working version of the game, and as they're handled as full-blown actors, they'll fall to sleep after a certain amount of time has elapsed and stop moving with conveyor belts. The same rules of course go for other actors, and in fact the barrels in Toxic Dump are a prime candidate in normal gameplay. It's just that you probably never really thought about it before. All we really need to do here is make a little sector, probably a triangle to save walls, and tag it as ST17. Lower the sector floor really far down, put something like a master switch in there, put the keycard on the floor of that sector, and have something activate the master switch or activator. Sometimes you can hide the hole with sprites, but you really want the player to be somewhere else when the elevator comes up, or else you're going to see the object popping up through the floor, and it doesn't necessarily look very good. So what else can we do? Can we remove the object as well? Well, we can. You may have noticed at the start of these videos has text popping into being from nowhere. It's obviously being triggered by something. It's actually a touch plate down there, but where is it coming from? What if I were to tell you that it was both always in that location and coming from these 4 sectors over here? Upon closer inspection, these sectors are just ceiling doors. Now we're flat out abusing the way the engine works. Sprites have several fields of data that tell the game and the engine what to do with them. One such property is its sectnum, the sector the sprite is currently in. We mentioned briefly how objects pushed out of bounds have an odd relationship with this, in that the game generally won't run code on things that are in sector -1. It turns out we can lie to the engine entirely about what the sector number is. As we're going to do some basic scripting, you'll want to bring the console down and type script_expert mode in maps to 32, and then we're going to want to include samples/a.m32. There we're running expert mode, and we should have some other functions that might be useful later. We'll start small and add some weird lights to this dark corridor. We'll make a row of doors along this wall that hide some light textures. Then we'll place this decorative sprite on the floor. When sealing your floor doors are closed, the door sector won't draw, and so nothing in that sector is going to get drawn either. So we need to check the sectnum of those doors, or the little space behind them. It doesn't really matter too much in this case. Then we go to the decorative sprite and set its sectnum to match that. Now the sprite thinks it's in the door sector, even though it quite clearly isn't. If we close the doors, the sprites will disappear. If we open the doors, then they'll reappear. Coupled with sounds and a touch plate, you can actually make fake collectibles in a way very similar to this. I mean, we can also do some freaky things to our corridor, more akin to my text, and have a bunch of things appear out of nowhere. On one side of the corridor we have a mast wall with a door sector behind it. We need to make use of those scripting features, but at a very basic level with this command. You ready for it? Because this is a mouthful. You're probably just going to want to look in the description for this one. Do for I selsprites open brace set sprite square open brace I square close brace period sectnum, and then the sector number close brace. Yeah, that's probably easier to look at in textual form. Now when that door opens, the sprites will appear, thinking they belong to the door sector, and when it closes, obviously they'll disappear. This one is actually weird because sectors behind mast walls don't really seem to draw necessarily, but they kind of do, and the engine still draws sprites that belong to sectors back there. It's a little bit weird. I might need to look at that more, but I don't think there's much useful to be gained from prodding it around. This is build after all, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Still, for that matter, we can make objects float that should normally fall, make objects rotate improbably, and all manner of rather silly things. There are problems though. None of these sprites are solid. This limits this method's potential use, as pickup items won't work properly and monsters won't really play ball with it. But for solely decorative additions, it does work, and I'm sure you could make some really freaky things happen if you were to put it to creative use. However, the area you use it in has to take into account that the door sector must always be within the player's field of view for the sprites to draw. If the player can look at any angle away from that sector and stop it drawing, the sprites will stop drawing as well. You might be able to do some strange things with joining non-adjacent sectors, but that's up to you, and I assume no responsibility for the consequences. My example corridor is left with the undrawing intact, so you can get a feel for what happens. You might want to remove my mask wall so you can see when the door's in and out of view, but I would imagine it's pretty obvious. This sectnum tomfoolery is also a kind of curse, as you will need to be mindful of it as you develop your map further. It's worth enabling expert mode and parsing the script before even opening the map again, and even then, as sector numbers and sprite arrays can get changed at any given time as you mess about with the level, it could revert or end up mismatched without notice, and obviously you're going to have to keep tabs on that or your effect's going to stop working. Generally, you want to just ignore this while you're working on the level. Make a note of everything that should be using sectnum tomfoolery, and then make checking it the last job you do before you save the map. As well as we established, it can get broken just merely by opening the map again. Obviously, if you have a lot of this stuff in a level, it can be a little bit of a headache. Nonetheless, lying to the engine about what sector an object is in does have some additional uses, and I feel it's another thing that we may end up revisiting someday. In the meantime, I think this one's long enough, so I'm High Treason, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again at some point. Maybe next time we'll start playing with targets.